Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. I'm not sure what Tablet Magazine has against podcasters. It's an exceptionally good online publication. But a few weeks ago, we did a show with Leo Leibowitz, who wrote a piece in Tablet called "Are Podcasts Ruining Our Lives?" He seems to think they are. And now there's another Tablet contributor, the great Michael Lind, who's been on the show a couple of times before, who's just come out with a piece called "Nobody Votes for Podcasters." Michael, before we went live, you said present company excluded, although no one, I think, would vote for me. What has Tablet got against podcasting?
Well, those were their titles. It wasn't my original title. My point was that on both the left and the right, but particularly on the right, a lot of these so-called influencers have next to no influence on actual policy of the Trump administration or of the Republican majority in Congress. The key constituencies that Donald Trump as a politician has to pay attention to are Republican voters in general, who the vast majority of them will vote for any Republican who is at the head of the presidential ticket. And he benefited from that. And the other critical group is swing voters in swing states. And these tend to be high school educated or some college voters who they're called low information voters, which sounds insulting, but it means that unlike people who watch podcasts, they don't follow politics and ideas closely. And so you would never know this from reading the political press. You would think that debates among MAGA spokespeople like Laura Loomer or far right, intellectuals like Curtis Yarvin, that these people somehow represent an electoral constituency, and they really don't. It's kind of a faction that doesn't have any roots in actual voters. And I think what you see with some of the MAGA or MAGA influencers, however you pronounce it, is that it's been proven both in foreign policy, for example, in Trump's policy towards Israel and Iran, but also in other subjects. When influencers like Tucker Carlson turn against him, there's no consequences for Trump because it's you and whose army. There's no army of voters behind these folks.
Michael, one of the reasons I like having you on the show is because you don't always say the same thing as everybody else. You came out with a book a few years ago called The New Class War, Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite. We'll talk more about that later in the show. You have a kind of class analysis, I think, of politics, although it's not a traditionally left-wing one. How do you make sense of Trump and his following? There seems to be two readings. On the left, it's still, most critics of Trump seem to think that ultimately when you look carefully enough at American politics, it's the old wealthy white elite who are still running the Republican Party. And then there are some people who actually believe that Trump represents the underclass, the angry class, the lumpenproletariat, whatever term you want to use. Are either of those analyses right? Who is actually voting for Trump, and does class analysis make sense?
Well, it does make sense with some caveats. But let me first of all say that you can't understand right-wing populism, so-called, in the United States without comparing it to right-wing populism in Europe. So Trump is a kind of modern politician who was, this kind was pioneered by Silvio Berlusconi in Italy. And you have equivalents like Meloni in Italy. You have the AfD in Germany. You have, so this is a transatlantic phenomenon. So I think you have to start at the transatlantic level and work down. And what you see in the US, but also in the UK and France and Germany and Italy and other Western democracies, is there's a split between what I, following James Burnham, call the managerial elite, or Barbara Ehrenreich called it the managerial professional class. And these are highly credentialed individuals who dominate the higher reaches of power in large organizations, large bureaucratic institutions, public, private, and nonprofit. And this has alienated a lot of other people who don't feel like they have the influence in politics, which they used to. And some of them are working class. As the labor unions have declined, the working class has lost its major lobby in government. But others are entrepreneurs. You know, they're rich Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, and there's a tension between the bureaucratic, credentialed managerial elite, whose members work their way up. They go to the right, selective preschool, and then the right private school, and then they go to the Ivy League, then they work their way up in this Byzantine bureaucracy. And this is just a different mentality from, founders of startups. So you get this kind of weird bedfellows coalition.
Yeah, it's an unholy alliance. You wrote Hell to Pay about the suppression of wages. You were on the show a couple of years ago talking about that, seeing how the working class actually was hurt in many ways by Biden and Biden economics. Would it be fair to say, Michael, that perhaps in terms of historical comparisons, that the closest comparison to Trump in cobbling together this unnatural, unholy coalition of people who really have nothing in common would be FDR?
Well, if you look at his voter base and the regional base, the Trump coalition, ironically, is the era of the Democrats, from the Jacksonian era all the way up through LBJ, and not only FDR, but also LBJ and Carter. It really changes. The parties switch their constituencies. What had traditionally been the party of the Northeastern WASP elite and its outliers in the West Coast, like California, was the Republican Party. And before that, it was the Federalists and the Whigs before the Civil War. Now it's the Democratic Party. So if you try to explain Trump in terms of historic Republicans, it makes no sense. But let's look at trade, for example. Trump's views on trade are really not that different from a Midwestern Rust Belt pro-labor Democrat like Dick Gephardt in the 1980s. I mean, this was all very common. Up until 2000, because of the labor unions, the Democratic Party was more restrictive on immigration than the Republican Party, dominated by country club Republicans. The corporations, the Chamber of Commerce wanted mass inflows of low-wage labor, and the resistance was more likely to come from Democrats before the 21st century than from Republicans. So you're not going to get very far if you try to think about this in partisan terms. You have to look at the actual coalitions. Another thing that Trump, obviously in terms of temperament, he's quite different from FDR, but what he shares in common is the New Deal coalition had plenty of capitalists, but they tended to be capitalists who were outsiders. They weren't part of the Northeastern establishment. There were Jewish investment bankers. There were Catholics like Joe Kennedy, who were kept out of Wall Street firms because they were Catholic. Mariner Eccles, who was FDR's chairman of the Federal Reserve was a kind of maverick banker from Salt Lake City. He's a Mormon. I think he was from Salt Lake City, but he's certainly a Mormon. So you get this same kind of coalition of outsiders who don't necessarily agree with each other, but they just don't like the power structure, the establishment, which was a Republican establishment up until the New Deal, and it's been a Democratic establishment.
Yeah, it's probably not coincidental then that RFK Jr., Joe Kennedy's grandson, now is part of this unusual coalition. You yourself are not shy to get involved in debates, Michael. You argue that tariffs are good. You argue that, though, probably from the left. Is that fair?
Well, who knows, left, right. I've spent most of my adult career trying to rehabilitate the Hamiltonian tradition of national development in industrial policy and economics in the U.S. that runs from Alexander Hamilton through Henry Clay and his American system of tariffs and infrastructure investment and national banking in the 19th century through Lincoln. And it was the mainstay of the Lincoln to Hoover Republican Party. And elements of it survived in the New Deal era, even though the base of the Democrats in the mid 20th century was still the South. That was their strongest area. It was conservative Southern agrarian interests, and they were against industrial policy for the most part because they believed in free trade. They wanted to sell cotton and lumber and cattle and oil, right? So historically, whatever region of the country has been concerned with manufacturing has wanted to have some degree of protection from unfair foreign practices, while the agricultural regions tend to favor free trade because they see more opportunities in foreign markets than they see competition from foreign commodities.
Michael, let me ask you this question. When I think of you, I often also think of Thomas Frank. I'm not sure how much you have in common, but neither of you.
I admire him greatly.
Yeah, he's been on the show, and neither of you fit into traditional categories. He, of course, wrote the very famous book, What's the Matter with Kansas? How Conservatives Won the Heart of America. It's probably more relevant now than it's ever been. The way you talk, Michael, you suggest that people are pretty rational in terms of how they vote. They vote out of their own interests, generally economic. What about, so if that's the case, what about the role of culture? Of course, Trump is running not just on economic grounds, but also in cultural. The podcasters you talk about from Tucker Carlson onwards tend to focus more on cultural than economic issues. Is there such a thing as voting rationally out of cultural interests? This perhaps touches on your theory of elites.
Well, historically, the big divide that severed people, even with identical economic interests in the U.S., was religion. The Protestant-Catholic divide was a big thing. And within Protestantism, the mainline Protestants versus evangelicals. So these are huge divides. And you can have absolutely identical economic interests, but, you're a Protestant or you're a Catholic or you're a Baptist, you're a Presbyterian.
Yeah, and one of the things that's always astonished me historically is that the KKK, their greatest enemy were Catholics. Now, of course, the Catholic Americans tend to be, maybe not members of the KKK, but certainly quite conservative.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of a subterranean theme because the Jacksonian coalition in religious terms, they were also a disparate group. It was a strange bedfellows alliance. So they consisted of evangelical Protestants in the South and Midwest, mostly like disproportionately Irish immigrants in the Northeast, some German Catholics, and Mormons and Jews as well, who tended to be Democratic in 19th century, early 20th century. And they had nothing in common with each other, and they were very suspicious of each other. There were deep Catholic Jewish divides, Catholic evangelical divides, and so on. But they all feared and dreaded the liberal mainline Protestants who dominated business and dominated.
The WASPs, Michael, one of your favorite subjects.
The white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And so what has happened, Andrew, in the last generation is that almost all of the growth in the nuns, that is the non-affiliated or non-religious population.
I thought you were talking about the nuns, N-U-N-S, not...
No, N-O-N-E-S, not
the Catholic nuns.
Sisters of Charity.
I have a one-track mind on some of these things.
So, but they're called nuns. That's a bizarre word, but basically unaffiliated secular people. They are almost entirely the children and grandchildren of liberal white Protestants. If you look at Catholics, at evangelicals, there's been some decline, but not very much. But the mainline Protestant denominations like Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians have collapsed. And one way to understand wokeness is that this is, and people call it the Great Awakening. The term is a play on words, recognizing this, that the roots of this are in a certain kind of Northeastern liberal Protestantism, which has, for the first time in history, it's not presented as being religiously inspired.
So it's a kind of secular, a secular New England Puritanism, is it?
Yeah, it's a secular Puritanism, or if you want to go back 100 years, it's a secular version of the liberal Protestant social gospel movement. And what you find in that tradition is there are periodic waves or revivals associated with social reforms, and many of them quite good. So in the 1840s, it was, temperance and anti-slavery. And then around the turn of the century, it was the social gospel Protestants favored welfare reform and anti-poverty programs. Unfortunately, a lot of them also favored
prohibition as well.
And prohibition, and also sterilizing the mentally unfit, which tends to be forgotten. So there are these, and there are really two wings of the Calvinist tradition in the U.S. There's the New England and the Scots-Irish, and they both come out of Calvinism. But the Scots-Irish revivalism tends to take the form of getting back to basics. Right?
So you've written about this, and I know you have a new piece in Tablet. You wrote a wonderful piece back in 2021 on the new national American elite, which was this woke ruling class. Coming back to your analysis of why people do what they do in politics, their interest, is there a material interest here, Michael, in this secular Puritanism? Or is it because ultimately they get jobs at the Carnegie Foundation and all these other foundations?
Well, competition plays a role, and ideological competition has become more economically important. It used to be behavioral. It used to be social. And the same is true in Britain, I think. I spent a lot of time there. So like in the old days, you could, if you went to Eton and you went to Oxford or Cambridge, you could be a communist or a fascist or a Tory or Labor, and people would forgive it, right? But you knew how to use the right fork, with your salad. So you were part of the club. It was true.
We had Sam Tannenhouse on the show, who's written this enormous book about William F. Buckley. He sounds an example of that in the American context.
Yeah, and Bill, I knew Bill Buckley quite well. That generation, and he was a Southerner, but you had to assimilate to the mores of the Northeastern WASPs to be accepted. But then they might tolerate your ideological deviations. What has happened is, as the elite meritocratic credential culture, which is still centered on Harvard and other Ivy League universities, they still set the standard. As it's become more multi-ethnic, more multiracial, political views have replaced, like whether you, for example, I went to Yale in the 1980s. If you were part of the
you revealed that one. That took a bit of time, Michael, for that one to pop out.
So you didn't wear socks with your loafers. Okay, it was little things like that with the insiders and outsiders. Now, what distinguishes insiders and outsiders is, your BLM, sticker or decal on your office door.
Well, there are a lot of African Americans and other minorities who go to Yale and Harvard who might have other reasons for wearing BLM socks.
Oh no, so what I'm talking about is the use mostly by white, college-educated members of the elite of of ever-changing social values, and I compare them in some of my writing to passwords. Right? They change the password every couple of weeks, and so and this is not coming from working class and
Yeah.
African Americans and Black Americans. There's no great groundswell of support among Hispanic Americans for saying Latinx or Latinx. I still don't know how it's pronounced.
No, I take your point on that one. So in your analysis, the Michael Lind version of the world, Trump's attack on the universities or on the Smithsonian and everything else he outrages left liberals on is actually a form of what you might call class war. It's not just some idiot reality television star spouting off about whatever he feels. It's more of almost if not a Marxist, certainly a sort of a Leninist way of thinking about history.
Well, I would, class. You can think about class without being a Marxist. People have been doing that since Aristotle. But in terms of the American context, it's Jacksonian. So the Jacksonians were all of these different groups, as I said: Catholic immigrants, Southern Baptists, Mormons, Jews. If they attacked the WASPs of the Northeast, when they're attacking the institutions that the WASPs control, like the Bank of the United States under Andrew Jackson, controlled by Nicholas Biddle of Philadelphia, these other institutions, they're not really attacking the institutions, or rather they're attacking the institutions because their cultural and class enemies are hiding in those buildings, right? And if you don't understand the war that's going on, you think, oh, look, they really hate that building. Oh, look, they hate that other building too. But they're not after the institutions. They're after the people in them. Does that make sense?
It does, although some people might be listening to this and thinking Michael Lind's a bit of a conspiracy theorist, no different from people who talk about the deep state or anything like that.
No, class analysis is not conspiracy. It doesn't mean that there's some secret cabal with a master plan. It just means that if you have powerful people come from a restricted part of the population, whatever it is, a certain region, a certain race, a certain ethnicity, a certain religion, and all of those individuals pursue their own interests without coordination, the result will look as though it were coordinated, but it's not. It just reflects their relative power.
So in a sense, it sounds, your analysis sounds not completely different from the Italian sociological school from Pareto to Gramsci. Is that fair?
No. In fact, they've influenced me a lot. Michels and Mosca and Pareto and what
and Gramsci on the left, who
Gramsci on the
all
left,
inspired by Machiavelli.
Yeah, and the Italians are fascinating because the Italian parliamentary monarchy between unification in the 1870s and fascism was one of the most corrupt of modern democracies or semi-democracies, and it spawned entire schools of political science and also an entire school of economics that has influenced rational choice economics, where the premise is that powerful elites and factions, there's not some single cabal, but different factions, are using the machinery of politics. And they're using the economy for their own purposes. But this isn't presented as a conspiracy theory. It's just presented as a realistic approach.
Yeah, it's the nature of things. Americans, though, and Americans are very different from Italians, I think, if we're making cultural generalizations. You're comfortable saying this, Michael, but most Americans aren't. They think it's something rather unholy. That may be why Alexander Hamilton was never the most popular of people.
Well, it's true of most Americans, but I don't think it's true of most Americans who know about politics. Or I grew up in politics in Texas, which was a corrupt one-party. I mean, it was literally an apartheid state. one-party dictatorship before the Civil Rights Revolution. And so just growing up in Texas politics, I was taught whatever somebody does, Democratic or Republican, you think like what's really going on, right? What's really happening behind the scenes. It's like the famous question that Metternich is supposed to have asked, the diplomat from Austria, when the Russian ambassador died during an international conference. Metternich is supposed to have said, "What can have been his motive?"
and it wasn't a joke, was it?
Well, no, and the politics is transactional, and I've known lots of politicians. I know politicians, Democrats and Republicans, and one thing when I'm giving them advice, I say that a political campaign or a political speech is not a deposition.
The funny thing, Michael, thinking aloud here, politics is transactional. I agree with you. Donald Trump has made that explicit. Madison made that the logic of the Constitution. He said if men weren't angels, then we wouldn't need politics. And yet, so many people, particularly on the left, but even centrists and traditional right-wing Republicans, are deeply offended by that. Why are we so offended with Trump's transactionalism?
Well, I blame the group to which I belong, which is, I've been accused of being an intellectual. I don't like that term.
You are an intellect. You look like one, Michael.
Well, I'm
a text an intellectual, at least.
One book reviewer said I look like a small town banker, which I took as a compliment. But so, intellectuals, including journalists and professors, we want our theory of the world. I'm saying as a group. Is that we will come up with our master plan for society. And then we will persuade a minority of one of the two parties in the US to accept our master plan. And then we will convert the rest of that party, the Democrat or Republicans, to the master plan. And then the master plan will be imposed on the whole population, right? And so academics, journalists, unless you're a political reporter at the state capitol, they tend to think of politics in terms of conflicting ideals and conflicting theories instead of when I've taught courses at universities on public policy and democracy, I will ask, well, what is the purpose of democratic government? Is it to express the will of the majority? No. Is it to identify the public interest on technocratic criteria? No. The purpose of elections and democracy is to avoid civil war. That's why we have elections.
So that we don't. Thomas Hobbes once wrote a book about that.
Yeah, and if so it's realpolitik in domestic politics.
So, Michael, you half joke that you look like some people think you look like a small town banker. For people listening, that means you look pretty comfortable and pleased with yourself and happy. You don't look like someone who's lost much sleep about anything. Do you worry at all? I mean, there's so much hysteria about Trump, and you're one of the very, very few people who, either from left or right, who doesn't seem particularly hysterical. Is there anything exceptional about him? Oh, yeah. In fact, I've been critical of him for one thing, I've never voted for Trump. I cannot vote for this. No, I'm not suggesting you would, but you don't seem, he's not extraordinary to you in the way you're presenting your view of the world and Trump himself.
No, I think his coalition would exist without Trump. It was evolving before him, and it will be inherited by more normal politicians after him, I think. Many of his policies would exist without him. I think he's really the third real demagogue in American history, and I don't say that in a flattering way. Andrew Jackson was the first demagogue. Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, who inherited the presidency and was impeached and spared by one vote. And what they all have in common is it wasn't just like violating norms; it was being blatantly abusive and having no restraint in attacking other people, other politicians, other institutions. And Jackson wasn't quite as bad as Johnson was terrible. I mean, he would insult, his rivals in his own, national.
Well, he was also a very violent man, but the country was much more violent then than it is now.
Yeah, and so there's a good aspect to the Jacksonian tradition, which is that it represents people who get left out and forgotten by the insiders who historically have been in the Boston to Washington, New York corridor. The bad side is that when they don't have their own institutions that are accountable to them, and that's why labor unions are important. Then they have demagogues spring up. And the demagogues, in most cases, as I argued in the New Class War back in 2020, betray their followers. They either sell out to existing economic interests, or they try to found their own family dynasties economically and so on, but they use their followers. And that's why I argued in the New Class War, and I've argued in my subsequent work, that like the old technocratic establishment of NGOs and of woke institutions that peaked under Joe Biden was bad, but demagogic populism is bad too. I mean, these are two evils, and the third alternative is what I call democratic pluralism. This is rebuilding grassroots institutions that can connect ordinary working class people to government outside of voting, outside of elections. And historically, those three institutions were the labor union, the local political party, and the church of various kind or other religious institutions.
And Tocqueville, of course, wrote extensively about that. So it's the medium, not the message. The message doesn't matter. It's how we organize that's critical.
Exactly. And if you have a society, and this is why I'm concerned about excessive centralization, even though I'm a Hamiltonian when it comes to support for industrial policy and so on. But if you have a totally centralized society of 1/3 of a billion people, where a fairly small group in Washington and New York and other centers of power is running things, and then you have this atomized, alienated, disfranchised population. And again, the United States, Andrew, is the third most populous nation on earth, right? It's up there with India and China. And you cannot run a country like this without having some kind of decentralization of power and some kind of participation of normal people in decisions other than maybe casting a vote every 2 years or every 4 years. And if you live in most of the United States, you live in a safe seat or a safe congressional district.
Yeah, and we've done lots of shows. In fact, we did a show this week on gerrymandering. So that's your definition. You wrote a very nice piece for Tablet about this in May of this year. The radical presidency. For you, Trump, Biden, Obama, they're all examples of a radical presidency trying to seize power and spin further into lawlessness. So you would actually group the three of them together.
Yeah, I think the break came after George W. Bush, because Bush really stretched the law. But for example, when his plan to partly privatize Social Security failed, he got nowhere even in the Republican Congress. He apparently never considered doing this by executive order. But when Obama's plan for the so-called Dreamers, that is illegal immigrant children who had been in the United States a long time, when that could not get through Congress, he pushed it through by executive order.
So you don't really see any difference between what Trump is doing at the border or his other initiatives from what Biden or Obama did. Whether or not you approve of the policies, it's the means by which they're doing it. It's the imperial presidency. Had you not had Richard Nixon, Michael, another man you've written extensively about and thought about, would we have gotten Obama, Biden, Trump a lot earlier? Or is there something inevitable about it that Nixon behaved so badly that he stopped the development of the imperial presidency, but ultimately it was inevitable?
Well, it may have been inevitable. People from FDR onwards were warning that we were moving towards a Caesarist or Bonapartist system, towards a plebiscitary presidency. And James Burnham, who developed the idea of the managerial elite, also wrote a book defending the prerogatives of Congress. He argued that Congress was like, it's called Congress in the American tradition in the 1950s. Congress is one of the last barriers to this plebiscitary dictatorship, where it's a legal dictatorship. You vote every 4 years. The person maybe leaves after he or she is defeated. But other than that, instead of having congressionally passed statutes, we're governed on the basis of emergency measures, these tax bills and presidential executive orders. And if that's the case, then the U.S. is like a Latin American republic where the president essentially is all powerful for a fixed term. And then if the president leaves office, then the next president tries to imprison him.
Yeah, and earlier this week we had David Daly on the show talking about the redistricting apocalypse, blaming everything on Roberts and the politicization of the Supreme Court, and of course the toothlessness of Congress. I'm not sure you politically are on the same page as Daly, but you seem to be saying the same thing. So
I think that's too optimistic.
Well, but finally, Michael, you've written a lot about the left. As you note, you see wokeism as a manifestation of a new American elite. You also wrote an interesting piece recently for the London Telegraph about Mamdani as an example of a New York elite. I'm guessing you're not a great fan of his. What can progressives then do? You strike me as someone who's probably more progressive than conservative, but a different kind of progressive. Is it about political organization? Is it the medium rather than the message? Is it local politics? Might it be new technologies? What should progressives be doing? I'm guessing probably not vote for Mamdani.
No, I think it goes back to the fact that there is no single thing called progressivism and no single thing called conservatism. There has always been a strain of reformist upper middle class technocratic progressivism, the Wilsonian progressives, social gospel Protestants, and so on the left, and that has done some good things, but it always coexisted with agrarian rural populists and with urban union labor activists rooted in the working class. And it's the predominance of this technocratic progressive group to the exclusion of the old, certainly private sector labor, which has collapsed, and to these religious groups, which used to play a major role in the Democratic Party. If you think about pro-union Catholics or pro-civil rights African-American churches. So I think that the Democrats, it's not a matter of these elite, college-educated, mostly white progressives changing their mind. They need to share the Democratic Party with other groups, which they may disagree with. Does that make sense?
It does. So you did a debate with Jason Crowley in the UK recently, the editor of the New Statesman, Britain's leading left-wing newspaper, about the future of what you call the Western left after populism. Is there a word that we have to describe this? Is there such a thing as left populism, or do we need better words to describe where we're going?
I think we need better words. That's why I prefer to talk about democratic pluralism. And the basis of pluralism is outside of politics. It's the structure of society. We need to have a social structure where working class people exercise power in their workplaces. They have influence over politics other than electoral democracy. through mechanisms like unions, in some cases through religious institutions. So at the end of the day, I think the big division is between those who think there is a political solution for our social problems and those like me who think there is no political solution. You have to restructure society itself, and politics can play a role, but ultimately it's about decentralizing power to ordinary people between elections.
In other words, nothing much has changed since Tocqueville. When he came here in the 19th century, he observed the unions and the churches and all these other intermediary organizations that were key to American democracy. Unless they come back, American democracy is in crisis. Is that fair, Michael?
It's not just American democracy, it's British and French and German and Japanese democracy as well.
Well, Michael Lind, I'm going to let you go back to your day job as a bank manager in a small Texan town. As always, a pleasure. You always bring some iconoclasm to thinking about American politics that I think is missing. We'll have to get you back on the show in the not too distant future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.